Hi, everybody. Welcome to Odd Week Sunday School here at St. Andrew's Covenant Presbyterian Church. This is our lesson for March 21st, the fifth Sunday in Lent. And we're going to have a lesson from Jeremiah, chapter 31, verses 31 to 34, a lesson about a new covenant. So let's get started. The fifth Sunday of Lent, that means obviously that pretty soon, like next week, it's Palm Sunday, and after that, Easter. The fifth Sunday is towards the end of this long 6-week season. As we made our way through this season of reflection, we've had here in Sunday school several lessons from the lectionary assignments, stories of the Israelites trekking around, really sort of in circles, in the wilderness between Egypt and the Promised Land, between bondage and freedom. And many times on that journey, the people who had been so dramatically and steadily rescued and led grew doubtful about the whole project. Sometimes they more or less gave up on Yahweh, their great and unsurpassable God. As when they got tired of waiting for Moses, remember, to come back down from Mount Sinai, from his conversation with God. And while they were impatient, they began to worship a golden calf. So this tendency to slip away stuck with the people, even after they got to the Promised Land, even after they arrived in Israel. And this is a tendency that we understand ourselves. God granted these people the monarchy that they pleaded for when they said, we want to have a king just like all the other nations have. And then in short order, it became clear to the Israelites that most of these kings would be bad. In fact, the whole range of the kings was basically from a little bad to extremely bad. And these kings led the people away from God, people who were, as it turns out, very willing to be led away from God. And so then God sent prophets. All along he sent prophets, faithful people who were charged with speaking for God. People whose talent was not so much, as we often think of it, the talent of predicting the future, as the talent of accurately describing the present. The prophets tried to call the people back to God, to the God that had decreed covenants between them, time and time again. A covenant with Noah after the flood, a covenant with their ancestor Abraham, the man of faith, the covenant with Moses after Moses brought back the commandments for the second time. Here's how that one goes. The covenant that God made with Moses, it's in Exodus chapter 34, verse 10. It goes like this. Then the Lord said, I'm making a covenant with you. Before all your people I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world. The people you live among will see how awesome is the work that I, the Lord, will do for you. Obey what I command you today. So if we fast forward in time, many hundreds of years, we find one of the greatest prophets of them all, the prophet Jeremiah. We call him one of the greater prophets. Turns out you get called a greater prophet if you wrote one of the really long books. So Jeremiah, who prophesied in the years after the northern kingdom of Israel had already fallen to the Assyrian invaders from the north, and right before the southern kingdom of Judah was going to fall to the Babylonians. So these were tough times when Jeremiah was sent by God to speak to these people and tell them what was about to happen. Jeremiah is really and truly the prophet of doom. Verse after verse, in chapter after chapter of a very long book, God has Jeremiah list the many, many ways and many, many times that the people had failed to honor the covenant that God had set up between them. The times that they failed as a nation to fulfill God's commands, and the ways that as individuals they had failed to live moral lives as required by the commandments of God. And through Jeremiah, God made it known that time was up. The consequences that God had promised the unfaithful were about to come to pass. Jerusalem would fall. The kingdom would end. The temple would be destroyed. It was over. The people would be scattered and leaderless, maybe they wouldn't even be a nation anymore, which they more than deserved, as God made it clear through Jeremiah. But then, in chapters 30 and 31, we get a little interlude. God's prophet has something new to say here. Our passage for today comes from this section, so let me read it now. It's Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, says the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No longer shall they teach one another, or say to each other, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, says the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and remember their sin no more. This section of Jeremiah, and you can see why it gets this name, is often known as the Book of Comfort. And after so many chapters of impending doom, it's very welcome. There are three things about this passage I'd sort of like to lift up for us to think about right now, and I invite you to consider, what do these things have to do with our Lenten journey as Christians move with Christ toward the cross? First of all, about this new covenant. I think one of the things to notice about this is there will be one. What kind of God is this who would again start over with these people? From the Garden of Eden to the Baal-worshiping kings of Israel, God has had so many reasons to give up on his elected ones. And although this slow-to-anger God did rain down consequences on the people from time to time, he always used these judgments to teach and to improve the people. I mean, he's like the good judge who explains from the bench why this is the sentence and what's going on. And more than once he started over with them. That's what Jeremiah says God promises now. This is one of the ways that a covenant is different from a contract. Even though one of the parties, the people, continually breaks the covenant and the terms of the covenant, the other party, in this case God, he doesn't take advantage of this opportunity to turn his back on his commitment. If it were a contract, God would be out of it after these people kept breaking it. But God doesn't do that. God followed Adam and Eve out of the garden, and he's been with them ever since. The people break the covenant, but God does not. After the consequences, there's a fresh start. As the book of Lamentations puts it, and that's a book we also say traditionally was written by Jeremiah, God's mercies are new every morning, which is good news for us. So there will be a new covenant. The second thing I want to mention is that it's clear here, this new covenant will not be like the one that God made with the people at Sinai through Moses. Why might God be inclined here to be trying something new? That's interesting to think about. I don't know for sure. Maybe it's a new time in history. It's a new time in the history of the relationship between God and the people. Maybe now the people are ready to see something new. And how will this covenant be new? Well, it won't be written on tablets, for one thing, that could break or that have to be stored in an ark. It'll be written on the people's hearts. What does that mean? He says right out here that the people won't need to be taught what God's law requires. They won't need to argue with each other about the law's fine points. They won't have to look for loopholes. They'll just know what's right because of the good and gracious gift of God. And presumably, when they know it like this, they'll do it. And on top of it all, God says here, his intention is to forgive their wickedness, their iniquity, and to forget their sins. We're talking about a clean slate. But isn't there a really big question hanging over this word of comfort? This new covenant that will be written on the hearts of the people. What is it? What are its terms? If you do this, I'll do that. What exactly are we supposed to do? He doesn't say that here. God does not have Jeremiah provide any details. I mean, after all, there had been many, many, many chapters of details. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, it's all details about the covenant the last time, along with a very memorable short list of 10 that people were supposed to be able to remember. The people seemed unable to observe those details. Maybe details were not the way to go. One intriguing thing that Jeremiah writes for God here is, I will put my law within them and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. Is that what's going to be written on their hearts? I will be their God and they will be my people. So that's the third thing that I just want to ask, really. Is this the new covenant? That God and the people will belong to each other? And belonging seems to me to be the key here, and it's an interesting word. When we say we belong, generally that's a good thing. Think about the ways we use that phrase. We belong to our family. We belong to a church. We belong to an organization. Sometimes at a wedding we say it's clear these two people belong together. Many folks who have a cat realize that at some point that it's not so much that my cat belongs to me, but that I belong to my cat. Generally, humans feel safe and whole when they know where and with whom they belong. The idea suggests wholeness, that something fundamental has been restored. People need to feel that they belong, and not only to each other. Jeremiah's God here reveals that God understands that people need to be confident that they belong to God. So what will these people do when they're reassured of that? Well, they'll be free. They'll be grateful. And since gratitude is the basis for humility, they'll be humble. They will trust. They'll lean on God to know and then to do what's right. They'll love the Lord their God with all their hearts, with all their minds, and with all their strength, which means they'll love their neighbors as themselves. So, this language about a new covenant, a law written not on tablets but on our hearts, is this a good text for the fifth Sunday in Lent, when it's Jesus who's on our minds? Well, isn't Jesus the teacher who constantly pointed out the ways people misused the written commandments and the ways that people failed to love their neighbor? Through the ministry of Jesus, we understand that the time had come again when the Lord's disappointment in the legalistic and hypocritical God people was bubbling over. A prophetic word came to the people at that time through Jesus. But also in the person of Jesus came the embodiment of the new covenant, a reference Jesus himself makes at the institution of the Lord's Supper in the Gospel of Luke, a new covenant in my blood. Whose sins went up on that tree with Jesus to be forgiven and then forgotten? The sins of the tax collectors, of the woman at the well, the sick people in need of healing, of the demon-possessed, the Sabbath breakers, the scribes and the Pharisees, the hypocrites and the teachers of the law, the sins of all the people God belonged to, and of all the people who belong to God. So something to think about until we see you again. And speaking of that, we'll see you again after Easter. Our next odd week is actually April 11th, the week after Easter. So I wish you a meaningful Holy Week, a very warm and joyful and hopeful Easter. Be well.